Okay, let's get started. We have a grand total of 4 lectures left in the semester. Today we are going to talk about why we might want to evolve body plans and control policies for robots together. And then we will finish this section on evolving bodies and brains on Thursday with a lecture on an idea called morphological protection. This is some recent work by a former student in this class, actually, about how to actually make it easier for evolution to make changes to the body without breaking the behavior generated by the controller. And vice versa, if there's a change to the controller, making sure that it still works with the existing body. So we'll talk about that next time. The final week is going to be a bit of a miscellaneous collection of odds and ends of some things that are sort of very recent in the literature, but I think are worthwhile to talk about in this class. As I mentioned several times by now, evolutionary robotics is a new field, so there's still a lot of interesting ideas coming out in the literature from one year to the next. So we're going to touch on some very recent ideas. We're going to talk about a neural network quine in the last lecture. This was published in a paper 3 weeks ago, so this is all sort of brand new work, and we'll explore it all together. A week from now, on Tuesday, another one of my PhD students, Anton Bernatsky, will be here, and he will be talking about some of his research that connects together some of the ideas we talked about when we discussed modularity back in lecture 13 with evolving bodies and brains. How might you evolve body plans of robots so that they're better able to receive modular neural networks? We talked about why modularity is good. It turns out that modular neural networks don't always work when you drop them inside a given robot in a given environment. So how do you find the right body that admits modular controllers? Again, that's some brand new work that Anton's going to talk about on Tuesday. Okay, and then that will finish up the course, and then you'll have a week or so to continue working on your final project, which you'll be presenting orally and in written form during our exam period. And again, we'll talk about that next week. Okay, speaking of the final project, you are now all done with your written reports. Grad students, you might have noticed I had an 8th weekly report on here for you. I've removed that, so you're only submitting 7 of these weekly reports, which gives a total of, I think this should be 7 times 2. We'll figure it out. Anyways, there is no weekly report 8 for the grad students, just 7 weekly reports, and we'll figure out the weighting here for grades later. Okay, so from now until the exam period, you're completely free to continue working on your final project and developing ideas. And as promised, we'll continue on with a few tips and tricks in PyroSim to help you figure out whether your robots are actually evolving compared to random controllers, or random robots. So here's a bit of code that I wrote up this morning. This is just to sort of show you how you might keep track of the evolutionary process of your robots. You'll remember that in this course many times now we've seen these fitness plots where we have G for number of generations along the horizontal axis and fitness plotted along the vertical axis. And if evolution is actually doing anything, we see a gradual increase in the fitness of robots in the population over evolutionary time. I mentioned one of the main things we're looking for when you orally present your final project at the end is going to be 2 videos. One of a random robot in your environment, and another one is a robot, an evolved robot in the same environment. And visually, by looking at those 2 videos, we should be able to see that you were able to make evolutionary progress on your task. I gave you the example from last year of the billiard ball robot that drives around on the top of the pool table and knocks one ball into the other pocket. The moment you see that video, you know that there is a very, very low probability that a random controller in that robot would produce that behavior, right? So that's the main thing that we're looking for. You're showing us a video of an evolved behavior that would be very, very improbable to occur at random. That's what we're looking for in terms of evidence. Okay. On top of that, you might also want to try and convince us of the evolutionary progress of your robots using a fitness curve. How do you create a fitness curve? Well, what you're going to do is as you run your genetic algorithm, or some of you have gone back to the parallel hill climber, that's fine as well. As the parallel hill climber or the genetic algorithm makes progress over generations, you're going to write out the fitness of the most fit robot in the population at every given generation. And the best way to do this is to store that fitness in a vector. And when your genetic algorithm finishes, you dump that vector of fitness values to a file. So in this cartoon example here, I might run this code tonight for about 8 hours, and tomorrow morning there will be sitting in my directory a file called fitnesses._night1.p. So these are the fitness values produced by the GA that I ran on night number 1. Night number 2, tomorrow night, I might run exactly the same code, but the only change I make is change this 1 to a 2. And after the second night, after the second night, I'm going to have 2 files sitting in my directory. This might be the results from night number 1. This might be the results from night number 2. All right? Okay. So I'm saving out these vectors, and then I would create a separate file which would read these pickled files in, pickle.load, and use matplotlib to draw these curves. And if you go back and look at the sensors project, that was where you were using matplotlib to draw changes in sensor values for a single robot. You can use more or less the same code to draw that. Yes?
If we want to do all of our statistics and graphics in R instead of Python, are we allowed to do that? We write out a CSV from Python and then import it into
Absolutely. So if you're comfortable with R or any other statistics or visualization package, that's perfectly fine with us. Doesn't matter how you present it. It's up to you to try and convince us that your evolutionary process is making progress. Question?
When you were talking earlier about contrasting a random robot with your Evolve model,
Yes.
do you combine in the same simulation or just videos side by side?
That's a good question. So in terms of the videos, they're sort of side by side, or you might want to show one and then show the next one. That's the main thing we're looking for, right? On top of that, you might then want to show us some statistics or some data about how did your GA do versus random search. And we're going to talk about random search in a moment. But first, I wanted to just talk about how to visualize results from your GA or your parallel hill climber. Okay. Just remember, obviously, I'm taping all of these videos, so if you want to go back and watch the last 5 videos for the first 5 or 10 minutes, you can see all the different tips and tricks that I've been talking about to help with your final project. Okay, so I've set up this genetic algorithm in a particular way, which should look pretty familiar to you. I create a genetic algorithm. I then create this vector of fitnesses, and the length of this vector is the number of generations. So I'm going to have G elements in this vector. I'm then going to iterate over G num generations. At the beginning of each generation, I evaluate the individuals in the population. So now after this call, every individual in the population will have a fitness value assigned to it. Lower is worse, higher is better. I've written a new function for my genetic algorithm that will return a single number, which is the fitness of the best robot in the population. It's up to you to implement that function. And it'll store it in the gth location of the fitnesses vector. Right? Pretty straightforward. Okay. After that, I then kill all the individuals in the population that have low fitness, which leaves a bunch of empty slots in the population, and I fill those empty slots with randomly modified copies of the survivors. Right? Okay, so again, depending on the GA or the parallel hill climber, these functions are going to be implemented in different ways. And then when that's finished, write it all out to a vector. Okay, and again, depending on how much time you have, you might run this code one night, 2 nights, 3 nights, and every time you do, you're going to get one of these curves. You would write another file that's going to read in each vector and draw each vector as a curve using matplotlib or R or Excel. Doesn't really matter to us. Okay, so what does this mean? If I were to show you this, has my evolutionary algorithm actually made progress? It's kind of hard to tell at this point. There are different ways you could tackle this. You could look at the fitness values of the most fit individuals that appear at the end of an evolutionary run and compare them to the fitnesses of the initial random robots. So in this case, I have a sample that contains 2 numbers. And over here, I have a second sample that contains 2 numbers. I can apply a statistical test to ask whether this pair of numbers is higher than this pair of numbers. If you're comfortable with statistics, you can go ahead and do that. That's perfectly fine. Another thing you can do is to take this code, and by adding 1 line to it, I'll go back and forth here so you can see it. It's right here. You can basically knock out your evolutionary algorithm, and now instead of dropping a whole bunch of points on the fitness landscape, and those points are going to try and climb their local hills, their local optima, instead the points are going to move at random. What does that mean? Well, in our original code, we evaluated all the individuals and we assigned fitnesses to them where hopefully robots that did better at whatever we want them to do got higher fitness values, and robots that didn't do so well at what we wanted them to do got lower fitness values. Right after I stored the actual fitness values, I set all the fitnesses to 0. What happens now when I call kill individuals? Which individuals are going to be killed off? Who knows, right? It doesn't matter whether your original fitness was high or low. We've leveled the playing board. Everyone has an equal probability of being killed because everybody has a fitness of 0 now. And among all the survivors, they're all equally likely to produce offspring, right? So imagine you had 2 individuals, one that was sitting on the slope of a hill and one that was sitting down in a valley, where this one has higher fitness than this one. When we set fitness to 0, we made the fitness landscape perfectly flat. So the individual that was on the hill is just as likely to die as the individual that was down in the valley. So this piece of code is also going to move points around the fitness landscape, but they are not going to climb hills. They're going to move at random. Right? Note, however, that we are still storing the fitnesses of the most fit robot just before we zero out all the fitnesses. And then we store those fitness values in a file. If I were to read back in this vector and draw the curve, what do you think the curve would look like?
More or less a horizontal line.
More or less a horizontal line, right? So it's gonna jump around a little bit because obviously just by random chance, some are gonna have slightly higher fitness than others. I'll call this R1 to indicate that it's a random run, and I'll change these to G1 and G2 to remind myself that these are the results of a genetic algorithm and these are the results of a random search. So on night number 1 now, I might run my GA and store the fitnesses. Second night, I might do a run of random search. Third night, a run of my genetic algorithm again. Fourth night, I'll do another run of random search. And if I continue this process, and if my genetic algorithm is actually successfully climbing the slopes of optima in the fitness landscape, I should see that this set of curves over evolutionary time gradually climbs above this set of curves. Yes?
If we can show that evolution is happening, but like our main goal in our proposal doesn't actually happen, is that okay? Like if we're like, I want to throw the ball, but it doesn't throw the ball, but it's still climbing the hills.
That's right, exactly. So this might be, for example, throwing the ball, but the ball does not land near the other target object, right? So this doesn't necessarily mean you've been able to evolve your robot to do everything you wanted it to do. The minimum bar for the final project is showing us that your robot, your evolutionary algorithm is working. It's doing something other than random search, right? If this set of curves and this set of curves overlap one another, then you might as well not be doing the genetic algorithm, right? It's not actually working. You don't have the right fitness function, or you haven't been running it for long enough, or the fitness function is too difficult. Most of the fitness landscape is flat, and it can never find the slope of a local optima and start to make progress. This is what you're really looking for, right? This is also a useful tool, not just at the end to convince all of us that you were able to successfully evolve some robot behavior, but also useful for yourself. So instead of running this overnight, you might change the for loop here to run for 10 minutes and do over an hour, you might do 3 runs of 10 minutes of the GA and 3 runs of 10 minutes of the random search. And given 10 minutes of evolutionary time, is your genetic algorithm starting to do better than random search, right? So within a short period of time, you can sort of test or prototype your system to make sure everything's working. At that point, then you might be ready to do 3 or 4 nights of evolutionary runs. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, so back to lecture. Okay, as promised, we're moving on now to a discussion about why might we want to evolve robot body plans. Throughout most of this course, we've spent most of our time talking about the how rather than the why, right? How did these investigators evolve the robots to do X? And along the way, some of the time I mentioned why they wanted to do it, but we focused mostly on the how. So towards the end of the course now, we're going to try and kind of step back a little bit and focus more on the why. Why are we bothering to try and evolve robots rather than build them by hand and use a learning algorithm to train just their neural network? What's the point, really? So just to get used to the difference between how and why, let's go back and revisit a few of the experiments we've already seen. You remember a few lectures back, we talked about the female and male robots. Females couldn't move, but they could emit a song. The males could move and they could listen, but they could not emit a song. We talked about all the hows of that. The female neural networks produced a song at their output layer, and the song was heard by a male. If the male moved within the signaling radius of a female, that song would then appear at their input layer. All of those details are the how, right? Why? Why did those investigators make that kind of seemingly odd experiment? What was the point?
It seemed like a basic science question to me. So they were using evolutionary algorithms to look at the evolution of communication between males and females. So it's like an actual biology question answered with modern technology.
Exactly, right? So they're trying to answer a biology question, which is how does signaling or how does communication evolve? We know communication evolved. We're communicating right now, but no one actually saw it happen, right? We have evidence after the fact, but to actually watch it happen in real time, no one had been able to do that. So the investigators made this biological model. From our point of view, it was an evolutionary robotics experiment, but it was a model to try and test this biological hypothesis about why does language evolve and under what conditions might it evolve? That's the why, right? Then they devised this experiment with all the how, but it was to answer this question. Okay, let's take another example. Remember we talked about legged locomotion, and we talked specifically about bipedal locomotion. There's a nice benefit to bipedal locomotion, which we all benefit from. Why did the investigators in lecture 12 evolve a passive dynamic walker, remember one that walks downhill, and then a hybrid dynamic walker which walks over flat ground? And if you remember that experiment, it was quite involved. There were a lot of moving pieces to that. There was a lot of how in there, a lot of experimental detail. But why? Why did they bother doing it?
It was about minimizing energy expenditure.
About minimizing energy expenditure, right? Passive dynamic walking, as the name implies. Half of the time when your legs are moving, the muscles in your legs are relaxed. You're saving energy, right? So it makes sense. Now we have a very engineering goal, not a biological goal. We'd like to make machines that can get from point A to point B in the real world, like us, using as little energy as possible, right? And one way to do that is to copy more or less the way that we walk, using this idea of passive dynamic locomotion. When you have to travel over flat ground, you need this hybrid dynamic locomotion, right? You need to tense your muscles, or in the case of the robot, use its motors for a short period of time, and then the leg becomes a passive pendulum, right? So that's the why. We want to build machines that are energy efficient. But it's only half of the question, right? Because we know that we saw in those lectures that an experimenter, actually a roboticist, a talented one, could sit down and actually build a hybrid dynamic walker by hand. So why use evolution to do it?
That's much easier.
It's much easier, right? So when I was a postdoc at Cornell, I was in the lab next to the lab that was building the passive dynamic walkers. They put in 14, 16 hours a day with very fine sandpaper, shaving the underside of the feet to get the curvature just right to get the robot to do passive dynamic walking. And it's extremely difficult to do by hand. Not impossible, but difficult. So the why is we want to make energy efficient walking machines, and we want to do it using a relatively simple manner, right? Evolve them in simulation, and when 3D printers get good enough, we'll 3D print these things, and much easier, right? A real engineering why versus the biological why for the evolution of communication experiment. So a nice thing to do is to just sort of scroll through all of the lectures you've seen so far, remember the basics of the how, and see if you can answer for yourself the why. Why did we talk about it, and why did the investigators go to all the effort of conducting that experiment? Okay. So coming back to our theme on evolving bodies and brains, in lectures 25, we saw Carl Sims's first demonstration that you could evolve bodies and brains using the connection machine back in the 90s. Last time, we saw a much more recent attempt to evolve bodies and brains, but both of those experiments were mostly how, just to show that it could be done. So today we're going to talk about one of my experiments where I tried to show why you might want to evolve bodies and brains. There's lots of reasons why. We're going to look at one specific why question today. And we're going to start that discussion by revisiting a topic that I think Sam introduced you to when he was here as a guest lecture. And this is the idea of Evo-Devo. Did Sam mention Evo-Devo? What does Evo-Devo mean? Anybody remember?
Oh, sorry. I think
I heard it over here.
evolutionary development, right?
The evolution of development, right? So remember, we've talked in this course a lot about genotypes and phenotypes, and I've talked about the genotype as the blueprint for the phenotype, right? The thing that we're really interested in. Blueprint is actually not a good metaphor because a blueprint is just sort of a static thing, right? A picture of the thing that's to be built. Our genome does not encode a blueprint. What it really encodes is a recipe. It's a set of instructions that are carried out over time. Take this molecule and attach it to this molecule, and then that molecule to that molecule, and continue and continue and continue, and you get this thing, right? So it's more about, the genetic information is more about encoding a developmental trajectory, which is just a fancy way of saying something that changes over its lifetime, right? It's encoding a process, the recipe, rather than a product, which would be a blueprint, right? A static picture. That's the evolution of development. So we're going to start today with Evo-Devo, and this is a cartoon from our book to sort of put all of this stuff together that we've been talking about in this course, actually. We have, let's start with the shortest time scale here, the here and now time scale. This is the time scale that elapses over milliseconds or seconds. And this is sensor motor coordination, right? Your robot or an organism jumping or grasping the object or avoiding the predator. The use of the neural network to act based on sensors and maybe to predict sensory repercussions of actions, right? Remember our discussion about embodied cognition. An embodied agent acts and senses the repercussions of its action. That process is the shortest time scale when we're thinking about the evolution of behavior. Yes?
I was going to ask, how is the here and now short-term part of evolutionary development if it doesn't change the morphology or the control of the robot?
Okay, that's a very good question. The here and now, as these large arrows are meant to represent, emerge from these longer time scales, right? So the top one is not Evo-Devo, right? It's the thing that a snapshot through a developmental program gives you, right? Today, here's all the snapshots of our respective developmental programs, and you're listening, maybe you're writing and taking notes. Your here and now behavior is a result of where you are in your developmental trajectory, right? So we've got 3 different time scales here where each of the faster time scales emerges from the slower one, right? Okay. When you were an infant, even if you were here in the room, you wouldn't be physically capable of holding a pen and taking notes, right? That particular behavior, that particular act of sensor motor coordination, listening and taking notes, is something that arises from your developmental trajectory from an infant to where you are now, right? So the middle time scale here, the Devo one, more technically is called the ontogenetic time scale, right? This is all of the changes that occur to a single organism or a single robot over its lifetime. And the way in which an organism or a robot devos, or grows and changes over its lifetime, is programmed into its DNA by evolution, right? So each one of the species down here has a different developmental trajectory. Evolution doesn't tinker with eye color, it tinkers with the processes that give rise to eye color, right? It's a very important distinction. Most of what you've seen in this class so far, with the exception of Sam's project, this Devo part has been missing, right? The genome has acted more like a blueprint than a recipe. In the experiment I'm going to walk you through today, it is not. It's going to be encoding a change over the lifetime of the robot. So far, so good? Okay. Remember, keep in mind here this overall question which we're going to tackle, which is why evolve morphology. We'll come back to that in a moment. So we're going to put in this ontogenetic time scale to a standard evolutionary algorithm experiment. So in the top part of this slide here, I'm going to walk you through the control experiment where we are not going to have the Devo case. This is going to be the standard vanilla evolutionary robotics experiment that you've seen many times before. We're evolving phototaxis here. So we've got our legged robot that you see here. There's the light source front left of the robot. And I'm showing you a whole bunch of random controllers placed inside this robot. So this is generation 0. No evolution has occurred yet. These are the kinds of behaviors that we tend to get. You can tell by the clouds that this is sped up a little bit. Okay. We run our genetic algorithm as usual, and at the end of the evolutionary algorithm, this is the best evolved controller we got in the population. Not a very smooth or clean quadrupedal gait, but enough to get the robot to the light source, right? This is very familiar from everything you've seen before. What do you think the fitness function is here?
The strength of the light sensor.
Exactly, right? So exactly the same as in the 10th and final project, right? So nothing fancy here yet. Okay, we're going to compare. What you just saw was Evo-Robo. There we go. Okay. What you just saw was Evo-Robo, right? We've got Evo in the lower part of the slide and then Robo in the top. So Robo is going to be our verbal shorthand for just the sensor motor coordination of the robot. We're evolving the controller for some behavior. That's our control case. Now we're going to add in this Devo. So there's going to be change to the robot's body over its lifetime, and that change itself is going to change over evolutionary time. Okay. You'll notice this term here, morphological scaffolding. We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay. So how does this Evo-Devo work? Well, we start like the control case, but we start with a slightly different body. We now have a robot lying flat, and the forelegs are horizontal rather than vertical. And these are, again, all of the random controllers from the outset. There's already a bit of a difference between these random behaviors and the random behaviors you just saw in the control case. What are they? Aside from the fact that it's in a different robot with a different body. Still not doing very well. But there's a few, if you watch carefully, that happen to move maybe not quite in the right direction, but there's already coordinated behavior forward, which if you go back and watch the other video, isn't there. Why? These are still random controllers.
I think it's because of the stability of the robot. It's already stable as it's on the ground, so it can just use its limbs for motion, so it has that sort of snake-like
Exactly, right? So remember back to our discussion about legged locomotion in general. Any animal or robot that's trying to get from point A to point B has to strike a whole bunch of balances between energy efficiency, speed, stability, and I forget the fourth one, robustness, movement over lots of different kinds of terrain. So starting with this different morphology, we already have sort of different results. We're now going to introduce this idea of Devo. So we are going to evolve that flat robot for a little while, and after just a few generations, we get something that gets towards the target object. Okay, so we've done a little bit of Devo. Now we're going to introduce this ontogenetic change, where the robot's body is going to change over its lifetime. How is the robot changing over its lifetime?
You're making the angle more acute.
The angles are becoming more acute of the legs, so the horizontal legs are becoming gradually more vertical over its lifetime. So there's a single additional number associated with this robot, in addition to all the synaptic weights, which is the angle of the legs relative to the body. There's just one number because all four are going to have the same angle relative to the body. So far, so good? Question?
Why do they have all the same angle relative to the body?
Because we wanted to keep the experiment simple. Okay, so there's just going to be one number, one knob that we can turn that's going to change the body of the robot.
Oh.
And then there's 60 other knobs, which are the weights of the synapses. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of parameters, which are the synaptic weights, and this one additional parameter, which changes the morphology of the robot. I just finished telling you that in reality, evolution tunes this knob, right? The thing that changes how the robot or the organism changes over its lifetime. And the experiments are going to show you for now, we as the investigators are going to change that knob. We're not going to allow Evo to change it. So it's not strictly Evo-Devo, but we put Devo in there. We have control over the knob. So what do I mean by we, the investigators, have control over the knob? Well, in the first few generations here, the knob is set to 0. The robot lies flat and stays flat, and evolution just evolves the synaptic weights to get the robot to the light source. And we let evolution continue that process until one individual in the population satisfies some minimum fitness threshold. So that's get to the light, and we set whatever that value is. We say, keep evolving until you get one robot at least this close to the light. When that fitness threshold is set, we pause the evolutionary algorithm for a moment, and we make a change to the Devo program, which you saw here. So up to this point in this evolutionary run, we now have this successful evolved controller with the knob set to 0. The robot starts flat and stays flat. We pause evolution. We now change the developmental trajectory. We change Devo. And that usually causes this controller to drop in fitness, requiring a few more generations to get to this new controller, which succeeds again at the task. Remember our discussions about fitness landscapes? At the beginning, we had these points that are climbing this local optima, and one of those points gets to the top of some hill, which corresponds to this minimum fitness threshold. The flat robot gets to the target object, and we then change the developmental trajectory, which means the surface of the fitness landscape changes, because the controller that worked in the flat robot is probably not going to work as well in the robot that starts flat and becomes increasingly upright over its lifetime. However, we've only changed the morphology a little bit, so it hasn't dropped all the way back down into the valley. It's probably fallen a short distance. So now that original controller that worked for the flat robot, when we drop it into the robot that starts flat and becomes upright, maybe gets halfway to the light source. It's halfway up some new it's halfway up the slope of some new local optima. So it takes relatively few generations to go from the successful flat robot to this successful robot. Happens relatively quickly. Once this gets back to this fitness threshold, let's draw this out here. We had our flat robot that got to this minimum fitness threshold, dropped a little bit, evolution continues, and now reaches the minimum threshold again, finds a controller that gets this robot to the light source. You can imagine what's going to happen next. We make a change to Devo again and re-evolve until we get this. Not great, but again, close enough for our purposes. What was the change we made this time to Devo, to the body? It's a little bit hard to see from this video. So I made these little cartoons down here to give you a hint. What's happening?
Did you increase the angle of all the legs from the beginning rather than have it increasingly become more acute?
Exactly. So as you can probably tell from these cartoons, we're looking at the robot from the front or the back, doesn't really matter. And the inset axes here and the dotted line is showing the height of the center of mass of the robot over its lifetime, right? So when the robot starts flat and stays flat, its center of mass obviously stays low over its lifetime. When we changed it before, it starts flat with horizontal legs, and gradually as the legs become more vertical, its center of mass rises over its lifetime. Now we're going to change Devo again so that the robot starts with legs at 45 degrees and the legs become vertical. I'll play this one more time for you, see if you can see that happening. There's 45, and as it's moving, these legs become increasingly vertical. They're not perfectly vertical because the motors are moving the legs back and forth. We keep evolving for a while with this new Devo or developmental trajectory until again we reach the minimum fitness threshold. And then we make a final change to the developmental trajectory, which is now the robot is going to start with upright legs and maintain upright legs throughout its lifetime. Again, not the most beautiful quadrupedal gait you've ever seen, but good enough. Okay. So we drop one more time and climb until we finally get here with the final upright robot. If you now look at, we now have two different experiments, right? So the one in the top is the standard thing we do where we evolve the sets of synaptic weights. And this second evolutionary algorithm down here now is going to continue evolving synaptic weights like we did before, but every once in a while, whenever it gets good at the task, we're going to change Devo on it. All the bodies of the robots in the population change. Another detail you'll notice is that at the end, we're evolving controllers for the same robot, a robot that has vertical legs and maintains vertical legs throughout its lifetime. So we're assuming here our goal is to evolve a controller for this upright quadrupedal robot. That's what we want to do, as we've done many times before. Why would we go through the process of adding in this Devo? It seems like unnecessary complications. Why bother?
It seems like a effective way of combating the kind of like natural reverse instantiation that Pyrosim or any evolutionary robotics kind of algorithm brings, where they move clunkily and not organically.
That's true. So if you actually watch these two gates, although again the one that came out of this is not optimal, but it's much smoother than the one you saw for the control experiment. That's true. That's one benefit of this experiment, which is nice, but that wasn't actually the reason why we did it. Why did we bother adding in Devo to our Evo-Robo experiment? I've left out one detail here when I've left out a lot of details, but I left out one important detail when I talked about the evolutionary progression of these experiments. I didn't tell you how many generations it took to do this, right? It turns out, and I'll show you some data in a moment, that for the control experiment, it took a few hours back in the day to do this, to get the controller that you saw up here. In this process down here, even though algorithmically it's more complex, the code is longer, it takes fewer generations to run through all of these phases. So the total length of evolutionary time we need down here to find a controller for the upright quadruped takes less time for evolution than in the control experiment. Why?
So if we use these sort of evolutionary stepping stones through constructing the sort of the sort of behavior that we're looking for,
Yeah.
then it takes less generations because it's a jumping off point for each new step.
It's a jumping off point, right? These sort of different Devo trajectories, these different developmental trajectories are somehow stepping stones towards the more difficult one of start upright and stay upright, right? Which brings us back to the name of this process, which is morphological scaffolding. So we've seen this idea of scaffolding a few times in this course, where we're going to add something to the robot or its environment to make things easier on evolution. So it finds the beginnings of a behavior using the scaffold, and then when we have the scaffold, we gradually remove the scaffold and let evolution sort of polish up the behavior so that it works on the robot and the robot doesn't have to rely on these scaffolds. So in this case, the scaffold is the morphology itself of the robot's ancestors, right? We have this upright-legged robot, but its ancestors had not just different neural networks, but different bodies, more specifically different developmental trajectories. Where have we seen scaffolding before in this course? Seen it a couple times. Where did the investigators make things easier on the robot and then remove the scaffold and make things more difficult? We saw it all the way back at the beginning of the course when I showed you your first evolutionary robotics experiment, right? This was from some work I did a few years back. We're evolving this robot to grasp the object. This is environmental scaffolding because we made the environment easier for the robot. The object is placed right in front of the robot. It was relatively easy for evolution to find a controller that would get the robot to grasp the object and lift it onto its back. Every time it evolved to do so, every time fitness reached some minimum threshold, we moved the object a little bit further away, which means that behavior might no longer work, and it needs to evolve into this. Take a step and then grasp the object. Okay, I'm not the first one to use this idea. Environmental scaffolding or shaping scaffolding are sort of more or less synonymous terms. It's also been used in passive dynamic walking. Before the investigators who made the real passive dynamic walker, they made a whole bunch of these little toys that had very, very simple morphologies. In some cases, really, really simple, with these very big rounded feet. So the bigger and more round your feet are, the easier it is to perform passive dynamic walking. So again, a kind of morphological scaffolding. Evolving hybrid dynamic walking. Walking on flat ground with two legs is very difficult to do from scratch. So if you go back and look at our lecture on bipedal locomotion, they first evolved passive dynamic walking down the decline, and once that was successful, then they continued evolution into hybrid dynamic walking. So in that case, the decline and passive dynamic walking was also a form of scaffolding. Made it easier for evolution to discover hybrid dynamic walking. There's an older paper in the literature which we haven't talked about in this paper. Goes back to 2002. This is one of the first uses of a physics engine for evolutionary robotics. They had a biped, as you see here, and you'll notice these little arrows that are placed here. Early in evolution, when they were evolving walking for this biped, every time the biped started to fall over, they would apply, or the physics engine would apply a small external force, pushing the biped upright again. And if it fell in the other direction, another force would push it back upright. So I gave you the metaphor before for scaffolding of training wheels. This is almost exactly training wheels, right? The biped at the beginning of evolution cannot fall over. As evolution proceeds, these external compensating forces become weaker and weaker and weaker until in the last few generations, there's no compensating forces at all, and the robot has to walk unaided. Okay. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about these forms of environmental scaffolding because some of them might be useful for your projects. I've already talked to a few of you, and some of you have realized you've proposed some pretty ambitious ideas. You can either make things easier on your robot by altering the fitness function or by adding in different kinds of scaffolds. You can apply external forces in PyroSim, and it's described in the documentation. If you have a robot that's always falling over, you could even make things simple by putting two rectangular solids on either side of it, so it's walking through a canyon, and if it falls on either side, it's able to lean up against a bracing wall. So all sorts of things you can do in PyroSim to simplify things for your robot. So think about scaffolding methods if you're having a hard time getting your robot to evolve your desired behavior. Okay. Okay, so that's sort of environmental scaffolding. We're going to focus on this idea of morphological scaffolding. I walked you through one way you can add in Devo to Evo-Robo. We actually did this in 4 different ways, and I'll walk you through these. We're going to start with, again, the control case. We're going to compare everything to this experiment here. And when I say, or when it says here, no change, I mean no morphological change. In all of these experiments over evolutionary time, we're just evolving sets of synaptic weights for the robot, as we've always done. We're going to just look at sets of different experiments where we allow different kinds of morphological change. So, okay, so no physiological change or physiological or morphological change. There's going to be no change over phylogenetic time or evolutionary time, and no morphological change over ontogenetic time. No morphological change whatsoever. Okay. In the next experiment down, we're going to allow what we're going to call from now on parametric change, where parametric means just parameter, and there's one parameter, one number, and that one parameter dictates the angle of the 4 legs relative to the body. That's what we've already seen, right? Okay. In these little cartoons here, you can sort of see what we're going to do. We're going to evolve controllers for the flat robot until it gets to the light. Once the flat robot gets to the light, we're going to rotate the legs to 33 degrees downward, but it's going to keep that 33-degree deflection throughout its lifetime. So over its lifetime, there is actually no ontogenetic change. It's not changing the angle of its legs over its lifetime. It's not growing from an infant to an adult. It has a fixed form. But that fixed form is going to change over evolutionary or phylogenetic time. So this is somewhere between Evo-Devo and Evo-Robo. Okay, so no Devo here whatsoever. The third experiment is the one that I just showed you. Actually, sorry, it's slightly different. Apologize. Okay, here we still have this parameter that's changing. In phase 1, the robot is going to start flat, and as you can see in panel F, the legs are going to gradually deflect from horizontal to vertical. So now we have ontogenetic change in there. The robot's body is changing over its lifetime. And that developmental trajectory from flat to upright is also going to change over evolutionary time. Once one of these robots gets to the light, we're going to accelerate the change from the infant to the adult form. So it's going to go from the flat to the upright form over the first 2/3 of its lifetime, and then maintain the upright form for the last third of its lifetime. In phase 3, we're going to accelerate that change from infant to adult to be even faster. It's going to go from flat to upright in the first third of its lifetime, and maintain that for the last 2/3. Question?
How do you think that controllers would do in later experiments within the first?
You mean in here versus in here?
If you put the later ones back in the first
That's a very good question. We'll come back to that. What happens if we take one of the successfully evolved robot controllers in here and drop it into one of these robots? We'll come back to that question in a few slides. Okay. And then again, in the fourth and final phase here, we accelerate or we remove the infant flat form altogether, and robots are born with upright legs and maintain upright legs throughout their lifetime, right? So we know there's ontogenetic change because these dashed lines are not flat. They're indicating that there's change to the robot's body over its lifetime. That's the ontogenetic part. And we can see that these 4 dashed curves are different, meaning the Devo trajectory is changing over evolutionary time. So that's full Evo-Devo. So far, so good? We got 3 different experiments, one in which there's no morphological change, one in which there's only morphological change over the evolutionary time scale, and in the third experiment, there's going to be morphological change at both time scales. So going back to the cartoon here, there's change over the evolutionary time, to the body plan, and over ontogenetic time. Okay, that's experiment number 3, which is full Evo-Devo. We then added in a 4th experiment where now instead of parametric change, meaning that there's one parameter that dictates the leg relative, angle of the leg relative to the body, we're going to make topological change. So topological means that we're going to make a change to the topology of the robot, which for our purposes is going to mean that the robot does not have a fixed number of objects. It actually grows objects, or in our case, it's going to grow legs over its lifetime. So what does this actually look like? Okay. Here's a robot that starts without legs. And over its lifetime, as you can see, it's growing legs, and the legs are also becoming more vertical. So we're always heading to this upright, legged form, but we can start in different starting positions. In this case, starting with a snake robot that becomes a legged robot. All right, you're now all masters of physics engines. How did we do this? As you now know, in Pyrosim, you cannot lengthen a cylinder during a simulation. How did we do this?
You put while in between the sim and the weight
No, it's just one simulation that's running like yours. What's happening here?
Do you use a bunch of overlapping cylinders so they occupy the same space and then they serve space apart?
Getting closer.
You didn't save at that point in the simulation and then reload the robot with longer legs at each time step.
No, this is just one simulation. Yeah.
Were the legs always the same length, and you just had a joint that slowly pushed them out as time went on?
Exactly. Okay. So we call this in the lab the trombone trick. So there's a cylinder that's inside the body. It's connected to the body with a linear actuator, a linear joint. Remember, a linear joint is like a piston. It extends or contracts something. So there's a linear actuator that pushes the leg out the side of the robot's segment. That linear actuator is connected to a shoulder ball, like I showed you in lecture last time. And that shoulder ball is attached to the leg with a hinge joint, which causes the leg to gradually rotate downward. So we've got 2 joints per leg, one that extends the leg out from the body, which makes it look like the leg is getting longer, and the other one that makes the leg increasingly vertical. There's one final detail here. The legs themselves have to move so that the robot moves. So what's missing? One detail I haven't given you. We have one joint to lengthen the leg, a second joint to change the verticality of the leg.
Is there another ball joint that gives motion?
Exactly. Exactly. So there's actually 2 shoulder balls, if you like, inside each leg, right? So we extend the leg. The body is attached to the first shoulder ball, and the shoulder ball rotates down like that. And the first shoulder ball is attached to the second one, which allows the neural network to control forward and backward swing. So each leg has 3 joints associated with it. One that extends the leg, one that makes the leg increasingly vertical, and it's only the third one that the neural network has control over.
So in the video, the legs like switching colors. What does that signify?
That's some older visualizations we had to see that the touch sensors were firing. So when the leg comes in contact with the ground, we can see it better. Question?
Yeah, so considering like this is a very creative, clever use of the things that are already in PyroSim.
Yes.
There are plenty of things in PyroSim, clearly. But I'm just curious if it's if you're still thinking about working more on PyroSim or whether it's a finished project.
There's a ever-growing list of to-dos. There's many more features we haven't built in. You can contact Colin through the documentation pages, and he'll show you the very long list indeed.
So in this case, you have the full mass of the robot.
The full mass of the robot, that's right.
The instantiation.
Yes.
Crossing the reality gap to, in real life, we don't have the full mass. So does that affect how the robot can learn?
In reality, we don't have what?
The full mass of our ground parts.
Well, we don't know exactly what the mass of the physical robot would be. Is that what you're asking?
But the legs
Yep.
are at their, the leg is going to end up at mass 3, right? It is already at mass 3 when the simulation starts. But when I'm a baby, my leg is...
Okay, yes. The mass of these robots stays constant
Yeah.
over their
Is
lifetime,
that
right?
reality? Yeah.
Definitely. So if we are able to make a robot that actually grows, that takes on mass, then this will not transfer to the reality gap. We're not able to make physical robots that do that yet, but we could get there. You remember we looked at modular robots that attached pieces together? If you think of that attached mass as a growing mass, as the growing robot, then yes, you could start to approximate some of these things. Okay, so yeah, there's an issue about how to cross the reality gap with these, but for the moment, this is more like a biological experiment. We're just trying to simulate development here. Okay. So let's go back to our experiments. We had these 3 experiments, and I was in the process of introducing you to this 4th one, where now we're introducing this idea of topological change. Okay, so in the 4th experiment, we have a legless robot, and as you can see from this cartoon, it's legless and stays legless throughout its lifetime. Once this snake robot evolves to get to the light, we give it short, almost horizontal legs, and it uses those small legs plus the joints in its spine to get towards the light source, but it maintains this body over its lifetime. Once we evolve a controller that succeeds for this robot, we continue evolution using this body plan, and then finally with this body plan. So experiment 2 and experiment 4 here are similar in the sense that there is morphological change over evolutionary time, but not morphological change during the lifetime of the robot. No Devo. So far, so good? Okay. If you're still following me, you know where this is going. There's a 5th and final experiment where we put all of these pieces together. The video that I just showed you comes from panel N here, right? We have a robot that is born legless, lying on the ground in a snake form, and then gradually grows increasingly vertical legs over its lifetime, right? So there's Devo here, it's changing its body, and this developmental program, again, is accelerated in phase 2. So it goes from the legless to the upright legged form in the first 2/3 of its lifetime. Once this robot evolves to get to the light, we accelerate the infant to adult transition again. And then in the 4th and final phase, we throw away that initial infant scaffolding form altogether. And you can now see that in all 5 experiments, they all end with trying to evolve controllers for the upright-legged robot. We have 5 different experiments. I did 100 evolutionary trials for each of these 5, so there's a total of 500 experiments. I have a picture that looks like this of 5 sets of 100 curves. Which set of curves was highest? Which of these experiments is able to produce legged locomotion faster with fewer generations? Anybody willing to lay any bets? You can be sure because we're talking about this, it probably wasn't A, right?
The last one.
The last one, that's right. Okay. Why is it the last one? We'll see in a moment. Okay. So just to refresh your memory again, so in this topological change, we go from the legless to the upright legged form. And then by the end, we have this, again, upright legged form. You'll notice here this video is for a hexapod, not a quadruped. The 5 experiments that I just showed you, we did with a quadruped, and we also did it with the hexapod. And again, we'll get to that. Okay, so let's have a look at these experiments. They're not actually drawn as fitness curves. I'm going to draw them in a different way. I'm going to draw them as a set of bars, where each bar represents how many controllers had to be evaluated, or how many robots had to be evaluated before evolution found a controller that got the upright legged robot to the light source. So when we put the light source right in front of the robot, it took about 5,000, we had to evaluate 5,000 controllers over a few hundred generations to get the upright legged robot to the light source. Experiment number 2, it actually took us longer to do so. And in experiment 3, it took us even longer to do so. So this is a negative result. This is the opposite of what we thought would be happening. We added in Devo and actually made things worse. We were a little bit depressed and we were trying to think about why that might be the case. We realized that if the light source is right in front of the robot, it's it's too simple. The robot can just sort of move forward and get to the light, no problem. Okay. So we made things a little bit more difficult where we did 100 runs of experiment 1, 100 runs of experiment 2, 100 runs of experiment 3, got worse. We then started to place the target object not just directly in front of the robot, but front and left by pi over 16 radians, 2 pi over 16 radians, 3 pi over 16 radians, and then finally pi over 4 radians. So now the light is 45 degrees off the robot's left-hand side. And now things start to look different. If you look at the light gray bars, and the light gray bars are always going to report the amount of evolutionary effort required when there was no morphological change. It took longer and longer. It got harder and harder for evolution. Why? Why is it harder for evolution to find a controller that gets the upright-legged robot to the light source when the light source is placed further and further to the robot's left-hand side?
The robot has to develop a turning behavior.
Exactly. So with the quadruped you guys have been working with, you don't have that problem because it's radially symmetric. But if you have a long axis and you have to turn your body and head in the direction of the light source, you're much more likely to fall over to the side and no longer move, which means you've fallen off the cliff of a local optima, right? So things are very difficult if you're trying to evolve upright-legged locomotion for an object placed front left. But when the robot starts in the flat form and grows into the upright-legged form, things don't get that much more difficult. It's easier for evolution to do so. Why? It's kind of trivial, right? If you start lying flat, you cannot, by definition, fall over, right? So you have these flat robots that are skittering on the ground and gradually turning in the direction of the light source and then gradually standing up. And over evolutionary time, they evolve descendants that start upright and are able to turn and walk towards the light source. So in essence, what Devo has done here has broken down two problems, has broken apart two problems, and evolution can solve one after the other. So in legged locomotion, Mother Nature has to solve two problems at the same time, move from point A to point B without falling over, right? And if you start with A here, evolution has to solve both at the same time, which is hard. When we introduce Devo here, the robot can start by figuring out how to get to point A to point B without having to worry about falling over. And once it's discovered a controller that produces forward locomotion, evolution through subsequent mutations can make slight changes to that behavior so that as the robot becomes more and more upright, or the descendants become more and more upright, they don't fall over, right? So you're separating these two problems and evolution solves one after the other. Displacement, then maintain balance. Make sense? Okay, these are just the first 3 of the 5 experiments. So on a separate panel, I redrew here in the light gray bars, I redrew no change whatsoever. And now I've added in the 4th and the 5th experiment. In the 4th and the 5th experiment, we use the trombone trick, the topological change. Now you'll notice that the black bars are doing really well. They're much lower than the light gray bars. You'll notice there's a couple of asterisks here on the line segment that connects the light gray bar to the black gray bar. What these asterisks tell us is that I applied a statistical test here, and with at least 99% confidence, this black bar is lower than this gray bar. Let's see, that's right. And so we're going to look at that difference. And so the rest of these lines that you see here, there wasn't really much of a difference. So this black bar looks like it's higher than this light gray bar, but the difference wasn't quite clear. So there's no asterisks there. So you'll see differences, but we're only going to focus on the differences that have an asterisk, 1 or more asterisks associated with them, which indicates that that difference is very, very likely. There's less than 1% chance that the black bar is truly lower than, or not truly lower than the light gray bar. Okay, so as expected, it was the 5th experiment that really starts to do better than no morphological change at all. Okay, so this is parametric change for the quadruped, and this reports topological change for the quadruped. We then did this again with the hexapod. So down here we go back to parametric change. All 6 legs now start horizontal and gradually become more vertical. And now we start to see a lot more of these asterisks. So for some reason, for the hexapod, there is much more of a benefit to morphological change, which to me was a little bit surprising because a quadruped with fewer legs has more chance of falling over than a hexapod does. But anyways, we started to see this use of Devo. And then finally, in the last set of experiments here, we use the hexapod again and use the trombone trick where the hexapod starts as a snake and then gradually grows these legs. And now you really see that evolution is benefiting from topological change. So it took us 40,000 controllers to get the hexapod to the light source when it's placed front and to the left, but it took around 100,000 to do it with the unaided hexapod with 6 vertical legs. Okay, so this was, so now we can answer the question, why evolve morphology? Because by adding in this additional detail of morphological change, it provides a scaffold and helps evolution to find controllers for our robot faster. We have to do less evolution. So far, so good? Okay. What we then did was an additional experiment where in each one of these, actually let me back up a moment, how many experiments did we do? Each one of these bars here represents 100 evolutionary trials. We did 100 evolutionary runs. So 100, 200, 300, 600, 900, 1200, 1500. So we did 1500 evolutionary runs here, 1500, another 1500, 3000, 3,000 experiment evolutionary runs here, 6,000 evolutionary trials here. We used UVM's supercomputer to do this, and we kept the supercomputer busy for about a month getting through all these results. So this was a lot of evolutionary runs. You don't need to do 6,000. 4 or 6 will be enough for our purposes. Okay, so we have 6,000 evolutionary trials. For each one of those 6,000 trials, I took the best robot out of the population at the end, and I replayed that robot. So someone was asking about what happens when we replay this robot in other forms. The first thing we did, so there's one robot taken out of each of these evolutionary trials. So we have a total of 6,000 robots. I replayed back each of these robots, but when I replayed it back in the same body, in the same environment, but now added random external forces, so you can think of this as wind. I wanted to see how robust these controllers were. Remember that all 6,000 of these controllers work in the upright legged robot, either the quadruped in the top pair of panels or the hexapod in the bottom pair. How robust were they to changes in the environment, where change is just going to be external perturbations? This plot represents the drop in performance when perturbed. So now the vertical axis is reporting a percent, where the lower the bar is, the better. So we play the robot in its original form, and then we play it back in the windy environment and look at how much further was it from the target object? What was the drop in performance as percent? So if one of the controllers got only half as close to the target in the windy environment, that's a drop in performance of 50%. Yeah? 0% would mean that the robot moved exactly the same way in the windy environment that it did in the original environment. So again, lower bars here are better. And you'll notice that in a lot of these cases, the black bar, which is topological Evo-Devo change over here, those controllers are more robust than the controllers that operate in the robots that never saw any morphological change, which are the light gray bars. So I'm going to go back and forth between these two slides for a moment, and I want you to pay attention to this bar and this bar. So there's robustness. These controllers are more robust than these, and it took us less time to get these controllers than to get these, which seems counterintuitive. Usually if we want something to be robust, we need to evaluate every controller multiple times in multiple environments so that evolution selects for things that does more or less the same thing in multiple environments. So usually there's a cost in evolving robust locomotion, which is you've got to be evaluated in multiple environments, right? And this seems to have broken that trade-off. How is that possible?
The changes in their life already give them like a wide variety of different things, and it forces them to generalize the process of walking.
Exactly, right? So think about one of the controllers in the black bar here. This is a controller that successfully operates the upright-legged robot, and that upright-legged robot experiences no morphological change, but that controller is the descendant of other controllers that had to produce locomotion in different kinds of bodies. Right? So indirectly, we were selecting for robust controllers, not to be robust to different environments, but to generate locomotion in lots of different bodies. It's not that different from your own nervous system, which has successfully produced locomotion in you when you existed in lots of different morphological forms. There were probably some pretty profound changes to your nervous system to allow that to happen, but your nervous system is pretty robust to getting locomotion out of you in lots of different situations. Most of us can pick up a pretty heavy object and still walk, and that's a pretty big change to our mass distribution, right? This is something that's difficult for robots to do. One of the reasons why it's difficult for robots to do is until this experiment, no one had evolved controllers through a series of robots with different morphologies. So we get robustness almost for free, or we get it with fewer evaluations because the controllers have evolved to be robust to morphological change. And in this case, that has translated into robustness to external change. If I can walk despite changes to my own internals, my own body, then often I can walk while I also pick up a heavy object and carry it. In essence, my body has changed, but it's really the environment that has changed. Okay, a few more details of this experiment, but I think we'll leave those until Thursday. You have a quiz due tonight, and you are carrying on with your final project. Good luck.